Hello, everybody, and welcome to the wild world of modular synthesis, where we will learn to make beautiful and interesting sounds and music with voltages and waves. So today we'll be learning just about the basics, how to make basic sounds, just the most common modules that you will use. So before we get into modular synthesis, it would be good for a quick run over of regular synthesis, which is the process of creating sounds with voltages and waves and electricity, allowing for changes in certain parameters, while modular synthesis is an expansion on that, allowing pretty much every parameter in your synthesizer to be automated using a variety of techniques like LFOs or external input, maybe random voltage generator. And because of this added customizability, the synthesizers are built pretty much from the ground up, starting with the humble voltage controlled oscillator, or VCO for short. So this module, the VCO, is the main building block of pretty much every modular synth. And you can see here I'm using a free program called VCV Rack 2 to simulate a modular synth digitally instead of spending thousands of dollars on my own modules. Anyways, so we can see this voltage controlled oscillator here has a couple of knobs. It's got some buttons, it's got some inputs and some outputs. So the knobs are pretty well labeled, and if they're not, mousing over them should show you what they represent. So for example, this knob represents the frequency, and it is at 261.63 Hertz. If you right click on a knob, it will allow you to enter the value, or you can click and drag. So let's put that back to 440. And there are certain inputs that each module will have, and outputs. We can click and drag from an output of one module to the input excuse me, of another. So if we drag the output, the sine wave output of the voltage controlled oscillator, to the N1 input of a scope, we'll see this big red bar appear. Now, this voltage controlled oscillator is generating waves up and down very, very quickly. So quickly that with our current settings, it just looks like a completely filled in bar right here. But if we change our scope settings and we add a trigger, we can see that this is what it looks like. Just a regular sine wave, up and down, at a frequency of 440 Hertz. And they have other waveforms, such as the triangle wave, the sawtooth, or the square wave. Yep. And based on which one you choose, the sound will have a different timbre. So speaking of sound, how do we get this wave that we see on the screen to be a sound that we hear in our speakers or headphones? So for that, you will want an audio module. For example, we'll choose this one, built in, and then you'll have to select the correct device, and that'll be different depending on your system. And once you have the device selected, you can drag the output from the oscillator into the input of the audio. And that's a bit loud by itself. So that brings us to another module that will be useful, called the voltage controlled amplifier. So VCA for short. If we drag this in, it allows us to change the amplitude of a wave. So for example, if we take the sine wave output of the oscillator, put it into the input of the voltage controlled amplifier, let's disconnect that, and then control the put the output of the voltage controlled amplifier into the input of the scope, we can see that as we decrease this, the amplitude on the scope also decreases, resulting in the volume changing. So that's pretty neat. We can change the volume with this. Well, that sounded pretty cool. Pretty weird, maybe. A lot of modular synthesis is just finding sounds that are interesting. So this right here that we were doing, going up and down pretty quickly on the voltage controlled amplifier, that can be done automatically while we were manually moving our mouse and going back and forth. We can use something called a low frequency oscillator, which is exactly what it sounds. It's just like the voltage controlled oscillator, but it's at a lower frequency. So if we connect the sine output of the LFO into the scope, and we take off the trigger, and we change the offset to bipolar, we can see here, now it's making a lower frequency sine wave. So if we hook this up, back to unipolar, if we hook this up to the voltage controlled amplifier, and we reset the limit to 100, we can see that it's going up and down automatically at whatever frequency is set in the LFO. So if we increase that, we'll get some different behavior. And that was also pretty interesting, kind of speeding up and slowing down. So if we wanted to, we could hook up this LFO sine output into this input of the first LFO, called the frequency modulation input. And that does what you'd expect it to do. It modulates the frequency based on whatever voltage it gets. So if we connect the sine to the FM, initially it's not going to do anything because we need to turn this knob up, the frequency modulation percent. So this just dictates how much is this FM input going to change the frequency here. So we'll say 5 to start. And we'll slow this down maybe a bit. Turn this up to 20. Turn that down a bit. And we can see here, if we hook up the input there, -5 offset, -5 offset. Now we get this interesting pattern here, where as this purple line is lower, we can see the waves are more spaced out. They are of a lower frequency. And as the purple line goes up, they are of a higher frequency. So if we decrease that even more, 1 hertz, let's set that to 0.2, and we up the frequency modulation by a lot, let's say 100%. And now that's crazy. We'll say 50%. And we can see it's even more noticeable at a higher percentage. So that is already some pretty interesting behavior. Really with only 3 modules. LFO, voltage controlled oscillator, and the VCA. The scope doesn't really count because we're just using that to look, and the audio is just this kind of boilerplate. So that's pretty interesting, and we could, set this on our desk and let it go all day, and it'll just keep doing this. And we could, expand the complexity of this. Maybe have it change frequency every so often. That's also possible. The voltage-controlled oscillator has an octave input to set what note you would like it to play. And it also has a frequency modulation input. For example, if we wanted to, we could give it some tremolo or vibrato very easily, just by 4 hertz, 0.0, 0.1. And 0.5. And there we go. It's already, you can hear it kind of wobble in its frequency there. So we could add to the complexity of a system on its own and get some pretty interesting results. Or we could go a different route and take input from the user in a variety of ways and make it a more human-centric synthesizer rather than a machine on its own, sort of like a game of dominoes. You set it up and then you watch them fall. If we go the more human approach, it would be more of an active experience rather than passive. So this difference is called generative or ambient modular synthesis, where the human kind of has no say in what goes on. They just set it up and they let it go. And there's some pretty great videos about that, some really good examples on YouTube of people just letting a synth go for 4 hours, and it can create some really beautiful pieces of art. And we'll get to that eventually, but for now, just to learn some more modules, we will go the more human-centered approach, and we'll learn how to control this synth rather than let it do its own thing. So, to begin, we'll go ahead and stop the LFO, turn that down a bit, and we'll talk about MIDI. So MIDI is a way of an instrument and a computer to talk to each other. That's a very simplified example or definition of what MIDI is. So to get some MIDI input in our modular synth, this MIDI to control voltage, CV stands for control voltage, by the way, MIDI to control voltage module. If you have a MIDI device like a keyboard, it should show up somewhere here, but for now I'll just use the computer keyboard. And there's all of these outputs available to use however you want in your modular synth. So there's the 1 volt per octave pitch output, and that would tell the modular synth what key are you pressing. Like, is it a C3, is it a D3, like what frequency should it play. Then there's the gate output, which is on if you're playing a note, if you have something pressed, off if not. So we can see that green line at the bottom, and when I press a key, it shoots up to 10 volts. And then when I let go, back down to 0. The velocity output, that's the velocity with which you hit the key after touch, pitch wheel, mod wheel, all kinds of MIDI things that you'll find on a standard keyboard. But really, mostly what you'll be using in the beginning is the pitch output, the gate output, and the retrigger output. Now the retrigger is kind of like the gate, but you can see it just does that one line. And where the gate will always be on, the retrigger is only on when a key is pressed. It only triggers when the key is pressed. And that's some terminology that we'll get to later about gates versus triggers. But just know the gate is a constant signal, but a trigger is just a very quick one to make other things happen. So to turn this into a functional synth that we can actually play with a keyboard is fairly simple. So we could say that the 1 volt per octave pitch output goes into the pitch input of the oscillator, and that the gate output goes into this input, the control voltage input of the voltage controlled amplifier. And just with this, we have a very basic synth that we can actually play. So just like that. Now it sounds a bit primitive. Just the note starts playing immediately when you press the key, and it stops immediately after. And that could be all you want. I mean, that's definitely an aesthetic. But if you want something a bit more nuanced, you could use an ADSR, which is short for attack, decay, sustain, and release. So this will change the shape of a gate to match the shape we see here. So if we put the gate output from the MIDI to control voltage to the gate input of the ADSR, and then we put the retrigger output of the MIDI to control voltage to the retrigger input of the ADSR. And we hit a key. We can see that yellow light go across the ADSR. And depending on how quickly you hit the key, or if you hold it, the light will move at different speeds. And we put the envelope output to the control voltage input on the voltage controlled amplifier. And turn that back up. Now when you hit a key, we can see that this level changes over time. And we can change how that level changes by adjusting these sliders. And of course, because this is a modular synth, you can also change them automatically using these inputs. So if we wanted to add a low frequency oscillator that changes the attack, well, you can see it moving right there. Now, based on when in that cycle we press a key, its attack will be different. I don't find myself using that feature very much, changing the ADSR or automating it. But it's good to know, and it's good to have the ability. So with that, we have a very simple and very extensible modular synth. And of course, if we change these parameters here, we could get something that's a bit more of a pluck. Like that. Yeah, so that's the basics. These are pretty much the most used modules. Yeah, the voltage controlled oscillator for high frequency audio oscillations, the low frequency oscillator for automating other parameters in the synthesizer, the amplifier for scaling voltages so that they are not too loud, or for dynamically changing the loudness or the amplitude, the ADSR for shaping gates, the MIDI CV for getting input, and of course the audio so you can actually hear what you're making. So that is the basics of modular synths, and next time we'll talk about more complex modules and math that you might have to use when making a more complex modular synth.